The smell of gasoline seemed like the scent of freedom from debt. She didn't yet know it was actually the smell of her burning future. Elena sat in the passenger seat, teeth clenched until they ground. The SUV glided soundlessly down the night highway, its expensive soundproofing creating an illusion of vacuum. That silence was a lie. Her smartphone, thrown face down on the center console, vibrated with the insistence of a dental drill. Every 30 seconds brought a new notification from Apex Recovery Services. The vibration resonated in her temples, transforming the cabin into a torture chamber. Elena tried to outline her lips with a pencil, glancing in the rearview mirror. Another long vibration made her hand jerk. The pencil left an ugly streak across her chin. Elena stared at the phone with pure hatred. That pulsing knot of anxiety reminded her that time had run out. The glossy façade of her successful life was cracking at the seams, and hiding those cracks was becoming impossible. Her gaze fell on the dashboard. In the soft glow of purple ambient lighting burned an ominous, dirty yellow check engine light. That lamp had been gnawing at her eyes for a month now, a symbol of both technical and financial inadequacy. There was no money for the service shop, but admitting that meant surrender. Elena irritably rummaged through her designer handbag, found a roll of black electrical tape, and tore off a piece. She covered the indicator, physically blocking out the unpleasant reality. Marcus glanced sideways at this action. His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel from tension. Elena could see a vein bulging at her husband's temple. He was swallowing something unspoken, habitually choking down his grievances. Elena thought he was too soft for this world, too indecisive. She was the Atlas holding up the sky over their family, while he crumbled at the first sign of pressure. Marcus jerked the wheel sharply. The heavy SUV veered off the smooth highway asphalt onto a broken dirt road leading into the woods. The air suspension, long overdue for repair, released a pitiful groan. The body began to shake, as if with fever. Elena looked at the large navigation screen. The little blue dot representing their car was leaving the familiar grid of city streets and hovering in the gray zone of no man's land. Nothing around but forest and darkness. Elena felt a brief, sharp tension in her chest. This place was perfect. No cameras here, no witnesses. Just them and the decision that would save them from the debt collectors, from shame, from returning to that same small-town poverty Elena had spent the last 15 years desperately escaping. "Keep going," she said in an icy tone. "To the old quarry. No cameras there." Her voice carried a frightening ordinariness, as if she were choosing a picnic spot. Marcus didn't answer. He kept driving forward, gripping the wheel so tightly that Elena could hear the leather wrap creaking. His breathing became heavy, raspy. Elena paid no attention. She was focused on the plan. The insurance payout would cover the payday loans. Nobody would learn the truth. Life would go on. The car lurched over a deep pothole hidden in a puddle. The impact was brutal. The suspension bottomed out against the bump stops. Marcus, reflexively, with the speed of a striking snake, shot his right hand toward the glove box, pressing the lid down with his palm. This wasn't the gesture of a driver protecting a passenger. This was the gesture of a guard protecting treasure. Elena caught that look. She saw a fat bead of sweat roll down her husband's temple. She noticed in his eyes a panicked fear, not for the car, not for his wife, but for the contents of the glove compartment. In her inflamed mind, suspicion flared instantly. He's hiding something in there. Money? Divorce papers? A secret stash while she's scraping together change for coffee? That gesture became the seed from which fury grew. Elena felt something cold and sharp unfurling in her chest. Betrayal. He's hiding resources from her while she's drowning in debt, while collectors call through the night, while she's losing sleep trying to make ends meet. And he's apparently been building a secret nest egg all along. The SUV finally came to rest in the center of an abandoned sand quarry. Bright xenon headlights carved an ugly picture from the darkness. Thick clay, puddles covered with rainbow oil slicks, the rusted skeleton of some construction equipment. Marcus killed the engine. Deafening, dead silence descended, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and Marcus's heavy, wheezing breath. The atmosphere in the cabin became unbearable. Here, far from the city lights, the vehicle's exterior polish seemed inappropriate and alien, as if they'd landed on a hostile planet. Elena felt coldness seeping inside despite the climate control. This was a dead end, both geographical and existential. The perfect setting for a crime that doesn't count as a crime if it saves your family. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a sharp, tinny ringtone, a sound Elena hadn't heard in 10 years. The sound came from the inner pocket of Marcus's jacket. He flinched as if hit by an electric shock. Elena froze. Her husband has a second phone? A cheap burner? For what? A mistress? Secret deals? Marcus, without looking at his wife, mumbled something incoherent about needing to step out, and literally tumbled from the car into the mud. He hunched over, pressing the phone to his ear, and walked into the darkness, away from the headlight beams. His movements were jerky, nervous. For Elena, accustomed to the transparency of social media, this behavior became a classic marker of infidelity, or worse, a double life she'd never suspected. Elena silently cracked open her window. The smell of dampness and rotting leaves invaded the cabin. She strained her hearing, trying to make out her husband's words. Fragments of phrases reached her, spoken in a strangled whisper. "Yeah, I've got it all. In the car. I'll bring it tomorrow, like we agreed. Don't touch her." Each word dropped into Elena's consciousness like a stone. "I've got it all," meaning he has resources. "Bring it tomorrow," meaning he's planning a future without her. "Don't touch her." She thought he was talking about a mistress. Paranoia completely displaced logic. Elena became convinced. Her husband had stolen money from their family budget and was preparing an escape, leaving her to deal with the debt collectors alone. While Marcus stood with his back to the car, absorbed in conversation, Elena stepped outside. Her expensive suede ankle boots immediately sank into the squelching clay, but she didn't care. She yanked open the trunk and found the red plastic gas can she'd purchased ahead of time, just in case. The cap had stuck. Elena twisted it furiously, and the plastic gave way, but in the process she broke her index fingernail down to the quick. The sharp pain and sight of her ruined, perfect manicure became the final straw. Rage clouded her vision. Now this car had become the symbol of all her humiliations and her husband's lies. It had to disappear to pay for their freedom. Elena lifted the canister. Liquid sloshed inside, heavy and viscous. Gasoline. The key to salvation. The key to the insurance payout that would close all the gaps. Elena threw open the rear passenger door. She began methodically, with frightening calm, dousing the beige leather interior with gasoline. The acrid, chemical stench of fuel instantly filled the space, mixing with her sweet, niche perfume and the smell of the forest. Dark stains spread across the expensive upholstery like a cancerous growth. To Elena, this act of destruction felt like purification, like a way to burn bridges and claim the insurance payout that would solve all their problems. She pulled a silver lighter from her pocket. The cold metal pleasantly cooled her sweaty palm. Elena felt like an arbiter of fate, not understanding that she was destroying the only thing that could save them. Marcus finished his conversation and turned at the sharp smell of gasoline. Seeing Elena with the lighter in her hand by the open door, he released an inhuman animal howl. "No! Stop, you fool!" He ran toward her through the mud, stumbling, arms flailing. Absolute, transcendent horror was written across his face. Elena, blinded by her version of events, interpreted this as greed. He's afraid for his precious machine. He's afraid of losing his means of escape. When Marcus ran up and reached his hands toward her, she summoned all her strength, channeling all her accumulated hatred into the blow, and shoved him hard in the chest. Marcus lost his balance and fell backward into a deep, muddy puddle. While Marcus thrashed in the muck, trying to stand, Elena flicked the wheel of the lighter. A spark struck on the first try. The flame danced in the wind, reflecting in her dilated, crazed pupils. She didn't hesitate for a second. With a casual flick of her wrist, she tossed the burning lighter onto the gasoline-soaked back seat. The fuel vapors ignited with a muffled, voluminous whoosh. The cabin instantly transformed into a blazing furnace. Orange flames licked the ceiling and windows. Elena recoiled, feeling the heat on her face. It was done. No turning back. She expected that now they would simply watch as their problems burned away. She anticipated how Marcus would be crushed by the loss of his precious toy, but the unthinkable happened. Instead of running away, Marcus leaped from the mud and with a roar threw himself straight at the burning car. He ignored the heat and flames pouring from the rear door. He lunged for the front passenger door, grabbed the handle that was already glowing hot. Screaming, trying to wrench it open, slamming his elbow against the window, eyes fixed on the glove box. Elena watched as the skin on his palms began to redden and blister. Horrified by his suicidal behavior, she grabbed him by the collar of his jacket and forcibly dragged him back. The windows exploded, showering them with glass shards. They fell into the mud, and Elena understood with horror. He wasn't saving the car. He was saving something that was worth more to him than life itself. Something in the glove box. Something she had no idea about. Elena sat alone in the interrogation room that local detectives cynically called the fish tank. Her expensive beige trench coat, which had served as armor against the world's imperfections, was now hopelessly ruined with dried clay stains. Under her nails, with their perfect nude polish, thick black soot had embedded itself. She desperately rubbed her wrist with an alcohol wipe she'd found in her pocket, scrubbing until the skin turned red. She was trying to erase the pervasive smell of smoke. But that smell seemed to have seeped into her skin's pores, mixing with the remnants of designer perfume into a nauseating chemical cocktail. The absence of her smartphone, which had been roughly confiscated at the entrance, caused genuine phantom pain. Her hand reflexively patted her empty pocket every 3 minutes. Elena felt absolutely naked and defenseless without her digital connection to a world where she could hide behind beautiful Instagram filters. Here, there were no filters. Only dirt, cold, and sticky animal fear. She tried to find even a somewhat comfortable position on the hard wooden chair bolted permanently to the floor. It was impossible. This institutional furniture was designed for humiliation, not comfort. Her wandering, unfocused gaze slid across the peeling walls the color of hospital green and snagged on the word, bitch, crudely scratched with a key into the tabletop directly in front of her. Through a broken, crooked slat in the blinds, a harsh, dusty beam of morning light stabbed into the room, irritating eyes already inflamed from smoke and tears. The old ventilation system wheezed strenuously, but the air remained stale, saturated with the smell of cheap tobacco and old human sweat. Elena was beginning to feel that the filthy walls were physically closing in. The space pressed down on her, transforming claustrophobia from a pretty metaphor into a real, panicked sensation of suffocation. She drew air in short, shallow breaths, her chest constricted. Every second stretched into eternity. The door opened slowly, without a knock, creaking on unoiled hinges with a drawn-out screech that set her nerves jangling. Detective Brennan entered. He carried with him the heavy smell of the street, exhaust fumes, and paper dust. In his rough hands was a bulging cardboard folder with worn fabric ties. He demonstratively didn't look at Elena, completely ignoring her presence. He walked to the table and slapped the folder down on the surface with a heavy, wet sound. That sound in the viscous silence made Elena flinch with her whole body, as if from an actual slap. Brennan's entire unhurried demeanor conveyed he was the absolute master of time here, and she was merely an annoying obstacle. His emphasized slowness frightened Elena far more than if he'd started shouting or pounding his fist on the table. Brennan settled himself for a long, painfully long time, moving with deliberate slowness, grunting and adjusting the folds of his baggy, grease-stained blazer. He pulled from his pocket a cheap plastic pen with a chewed end. For several seconds he thoughtfully gnawed the cap, gazing out the window at the gray courtyard, and only then turned his watery, deadly tired eyes on Elena. In his gaze there was no sympathy, no aggression, no professional interest, only the infinite boredom of a man who'd seen this scene 1,000 times. "Well now, ma'am," he said in a quiet, creaky voice that sent chills down the spine. "Quite the picture." This absolute, impenetrable calm disoriented Elena. She'd prepared herself for battle, for accusations, for hysteria, but instead she'd crashed headlong into a viscous, swampy indifference in which any attempts at justification would drown. Brennan poured water from a cloudy carafe into a faceted glass streaked with water spots. The water was lukewarm, with visible chlorine bubbles. He slowly pushed the glass toward Elena, but stopped it in the middle of the table, just beyond where she could reach without standing from her chair. A classic trainer's trick. "Throat must be pretty dry, Mrs. Carter." Getting nervous, he stated without a questioning intonation. "No need for that. Your husband, Marcus Carter, has already calmed down, drinking coffee with the boys in the next room. Nothing to hide, so he's cooperating." Brennan said this as if in passing, shuffling papers. Elena froze. The mention of coffee created a monstrous contrast. She was here in filth, thirst, and uncertainty, while Marcus was in warmth and comfort. This was the first, most painful wedge the detective was driving between the spouses. Elena reached for the glass, but her fingers trembled so violently that she pulled her hand back. Brennan opened the folder and began lazily shuffling papers as if reading fresh testimony. He lied virtuosically, looking at the sheets rather than at Elena, so his expression wouldn't give him away. "Mr. Carter's singing like a bird, real smooth. Says the arson idea was exclusively yours. You bought the gas, you struck the match, and he's just a victim of domestic abuse, supposedly. Tried to stop you but couldn't match your hysteria." Brennan deliberately used the trendy word abuse with caustic, poisonous mockery, knowing Elena's social profile perfectly. This lie fell on perfectly prepared ground. Elena remembered how she'd shoved her husband into the mud. Now she firmly believed Marcus was using that fact to drown her and save himself. At that very moment, confident footsteps and loud male laughter rang out in the corridor. Elena reflexively glanced at the broken blind slat. Through the narrow gap, she saw the vague silhouette of a man in a jacket frighteningly similar to the one Marcus had been wearing. The person held a plastic cup in his hand, walked freely without handcuffs or escort, and slapped someone in a police uniform on the shoulder in a friendly manner. Elena's inflamed brain, poisoned by paranoia, fear, and chronic sleep deprivation, instantly constructed the picture. That's not a random officer, that's Marcus. He cut a deal. He's free. He's laughing at her. The metaphorical door had slammed shut only for her, while for him an exit had opened. This visual confirmation of Brennan's words shattered her last psychological defense with a deafening crack. In Elena's mind, that nighttime phone call in the quarry instantly resurfaced. "Yeah, I've got it all. I'll hand it over tomorrow." The puzzle in her consciousness assembled into a terrible but absolutely logical picture. He had secret money. He bribed the police right on the spot, pinning the blame on his wife. The guilt over the arson that had tormented her just a minute ago instantly evaporated, giving way to burning resentment and cold, calculating rage. "I was trying to save our family. I took sin on my soul, and he was saving his own skin," she thought, clenching her fists under the table until they ached. The instinct for self-preservation completely drowned out the quiet voice of conscience. Now, this wasn't betrayal on her part, but a justified counterstrike. Revenge. Brennan, carefully watching Elena's facial expressions, how her pupils narrowed predatorily and her lips whitened with anger, understood that his client was ripe. He leaned forward, invading her personal space, and abruptly changed his tone to insinuatingly confidential, almost paternal. "Mrs. Carter, I can see you're an educated woman. You're here by accident. You're a victim of circumstances. Why should you do time for someone else's crime? We have provisions for coercion, physical or psychological duress. If you write now that he forced you, threatened you, maybe, then you'll go into the case simply as a witness, and you'll go home, right now, in a taxi." He was offering her a life preserver that was actually a noose for her soul. Brennan placed before her a clean sheet of paper and that same chewed-up cheap pen. To Elena, this simple plastic object looked like a golden key to a prison cell. She looked at the pen, then at the closed door, behind which she was absolutely certain her traitor husband was walking around with coffee. Her animal fear of prison, of losing status, of this omnipresent filth, outweighed the remnants of love and loyalty. She slowly extended her hand. Her fingers trembled, but she gripped the pen's barrel with the strength of a drowning person. Brennan leaned back in his chair with satisfaction, hiding a triumphant smirk in the corners of his eyes. The fish had swallowed the bait, along with the hook. Elena began to write. At first, slowly, uncertainly tracing the date in the corner of the sheet. Then, faster and faster, afraid of changing her mind or stopping. The letters danced and jumped across the lines, reflecting her inner panic. She wrote practically at the dictation of her fears and Brennan's hints. "My husband, Marcus Andrew Carter, coerced me into committing unlawful acts. He threatened me with physical violence. I feared for my life and safety." With each written word, she believed this lie more and more. She was rewriting reality in her head in real time, convincing herself that this was how it had all happened. She was putting on a new, comfortable mask, the mask of an innocent victim of a tyrant, so she wouldn't have to feel like a monster. Elena scrawled a sweeping, nervous signature at the bottom of the page, and abruptly, with disgust, pushed the paper away from herself, as if it were contagious or burning hot. Brennan snatched up the statement with lightning speed, quickly scanned it with his eyes, and finally allowed himself a barely noticeable, crooked smirk. He unhurriedly tucked the sheet into the folder and carefully tied the strings in a neat bow, as if wrapping a gift. "Wise decision, Mrs. Carter. Very wise," he said. Helena felt a wave of intoxicating euphoria and incredible physical relief. She thought she'd outsmarted the system and gotten revenge on her husband. She didn't even suspect that she'd just signed her own moral death sentence with her own hand and destroyed the only shield she had. Elena put the final flourish on the statement, and that moment felt like a physical incision in the fabric of her fate. The cheap ballpoint pen left a deep, jagged trail on the rough paper. The sound of plastic friction seemed like deafening grinding in the cotton-like silence of the office. Detective Brennan acted with frightening speed. He snatched the sheet from under her trembling hand, as if afraid that conscience might awaken at the last second. He hid the denunciation in the depths of the bulging cardboard folder, and slowly, with sadistic precision, tied the strings in a dead knot. Then he pulled out a wet wipe and carefully, finger by finger, cleaned his hands, demonstratively washing off the sticky filth of complicity in her betrayal. Brennan didn't even honor her with a glance. For him, she'd ceased to exist as a person, transformed into a closed case. He muttered toward the window, his voice dry and rustling like old paper. "You're free. Sign out with the duty officer. Your things are there too." In that tone, there wasn't a drop of human warmth, no victor's triumph, no condemnation, only absolute, icy, professional boredom. But to Elena, these lifeless words sounded like angelic trumpets. The icy band that had been squeezing her chest for the last few hours burst. Fear gave way to intoxicating, almost narcotic lightness. She'd survived. She'd outsmarted the system. She wouldn't end up in a cage. Finding herself alone for a moment before the exit, Elena rushed to the cloudy mirror hanging on the wall. The reflection assaulted her vanity. Smudged mascara had turned her into a raccoon. A black soot stain darkened her cheekbone. Her lips were bitten bloody. She spat on her finger and began rubbing her skin with fury, erasing the traces of crime and fear. In her head, the salvational mechanism of rationalization was already clicking into place. "I'm not a traitor. I'm a strategist. I made the only correct decision under crisis conditions. I'll save us both, but from the outside." She adjusted the collar of her trench coat, pulling on her familiar mask of arrogance, preparing to step out into the world as a victor. Elena leaned her shoulder against the heavy vinyl-upholstered door and tumbled out into the precinct hallway. The contrast was stunning. After the stale air of the office, the hallway draft, saturated with bleach and the smell of old walls, seemed like frosty freshness. The space was distorted. One of the long ceiling lamps was dying in agony, flickering its strobe frequency. This pulsing light broke Elena's movements into jerky frames. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and began clicking her heels across the buckled linoleum. Each step echoed. She walked toward the exit, confident that the worst was behind her. And ahead, a taxi, a bubble bath, and a glass of cold wine. At the end of the long corridor, near the exit, people clustered. Elena's gaze hungrily sought confirmation of her theory. That same relaxed man with coffee, the image she'd constructed in her imagination to justify her baseness. She vitally needed to see Marcus the traitor. But reality dealt a crushing blow. Instead of a self-satisfied accomplice to the investigation, she saw a hunched figure being roughly prodded in the back by an escort. Marcus wasn't free. He was under arrest, and there was no coffee. Her entire mental construction, "He started it, he sold me out," collapsed like a house of cards, leaving her naked conscience in the piercing wind of truth. Elena's heart skipped a beat and dropped somewhere into her stomach. She saw Marcus up close, and the sight was horrifying. He looked as if he'd been at the epicenter of an explosion. His face was gray, covered in sweat and ash, a bruise blooming purple under his eye. But Elena's gaze was riveted to his hands. They were cuffed in front, and the skin on his palms was a solid, bloody mess of burst blisters and burned flesh. This was the price of his attempt to open the white-hot door. He hadn't been drinking coffee with detectives. He'd been burning alive. He'd been suffering physically while she bargained for her own skin. Logic shut down. Forgetting about the denunciation she'd just signed, about fear of prison and her façade, Elena instinctively, with an animal lunge, threw herself toward her husband. A hoarse cry tore from her throat. "Marcus!" She reached her hands toward him, but hit a rigid obstacle. A young escort with a stone face thrust out his arm, pressing his palm against her shoulder. This rough shove stopped her like hitting a concrete wall. Physical contact drew the line. Now they were creatures from different worlds. She, a clean, free citizen. He, a dirty convict. The chasm between them, which she'd dug herself, was now guarded by the state. Marcus lifted his heavy head with difficulty at the sound of her voice. Elena braced herself internally, expecting to see righteous anger in his eyes, hatred, contempt, everything she deserved. But she encountered something far more terrible. In his gaze, bottomless, deadly exhaustion and infinite dog-like devotion. There was no malice. He looked at her not as an enemy who'd sold him out for freedom, but as a frightened, foolish child who'd gotten into trouble, who needed to be sheltered from the storm. That gaze silently screamed, "I know what you did, and I forgive you." This forgiveness burned hotter than fire. Marcus took a step toward her, the handcuff chain clinking, ignoring the escort's irritated grumbling. His voice was shredded, rasping and coughing smoke, but he spoke firmly. "Lena, quiet. Don't cry. It's okay. I took it all on myself. Told the detective I torched the car for the insurance myself. You weren't even there. You were asleep at home. Remember that. Live in peace." He was sacrificing himself, his freedom, his reputation, to save her from prison. He didn't even suspect that saving her was no longer necessary. She'd saved herself 5 minutes ago, drowning him in false testimony. Marcus's words destroyed Elena morally. The world around her began to spin. In her ears, the lines from her statement, now locked in Brennan's safe, rang like alarm bells. He threatened me with physical violence. He forced me. I was afraid of him. The monstrous irony of the situation tore her apart from within. While Marcus was burning, saving their future, she was betraying him. While he was taking the blame on himself, she was hanging him out to dry. She wasn't a victim of circumstances. She was an executioner, saved by her own victim. Nausea rose in her throat from the realization of her own baseness. Elena, in chilling horror, slowly, as if in a dream, turned back toward the detective's office door. Brennan stood in the doorway. He leaned casually with his shoulder against the doorframe, chewing the arm of his glasses and observing this scene with the cold, squeamish curiosity of a scientist, studying the behavior of rats in a maze. He'd known everything from the very beginning. He'd known that Marcus had already taken the blame on himself. But he'd allowed Elena to write the denunciation simply to test her, to see the bottom of her soul. And she'd fulfilled his worst expectations. His gaze said without words, "Well, beautiful, was it worth it?" The escort lost patience and roughly yanked Marcus by the shoulder, turning him around. "Let's go, hero. Enough with the drama." Marcus was led deep into the dark corridor, toward a heavy barred door. Elena wanted to scream, confess, stop this absurdity. But animal fear for her own skin paralyzed her vocal cords. She stood and remained silent, swallowing salty tears. The heavy metal door behind Marcus slammed shut with a booming final clang like a gunshot. That sound cut Elena off from the only person who'd truly loved her, and left her alone in the cold, flickering corridor with her useless freedom purchased at the price of betrayal. The heavy metallic clang of the door slamming shut behind Marcus still vibrated in the cold corridor air when Detective Brennan's creaky voice tore Elena from her stupor. "Mrs. Carter, come back. We're not finished yet. Forgot something important." She slowly, like a broken marionette on tangled strings, turned around and walked back into the office on cotton wool legs. Now this room with green walls seemed to her not a prison, but a sterile operating room where they'd just amputated part of her life without anesthesia. Brennan sat at the table in the same position, relaxed with his back against the chair and hands clasped over his stomach. He was no longer playing the understanding uncle. His face had hardened, his eyes become prickly and empty. He gestured carelessly toward the chair, but Elena remained standing, clutching her handbag to her chest like a radiation shield. She wanted to grab her phone and run without looking back. Brennan slowly, with theatrical pause, removed his glasses and began methodically wiping the thick lenses with the edge of his greasy, cheap tie. In this casual domestic gesture seeped absolute, annihilating contempt for his conversation partner. He looked at Elena no longer as a valuable witness, but as a curious yet stupid insect that had crawled into a jar of formaldehyde on its own. "You, Mrs. Carter, are a remarkable woman," he said in a quiet voice without a trace of a smile. "Your husband was just locked in a cell, and you're already mentally calculating which boutiques you'll spend the insurance payout in. I can see it in your eyes. The calculator in your pupils just keeps clicking away." Elena flushed, trying to reclaim the remnants of dignity and arrogance. "That's my personal business. I'm a victim of circumstances. I have debts. I need something to live on while the investigation proceeds." Brennan smirked with one corner of his mouth, opened the desk drawer, and pulled out a document folded in quarters, a printout from the insurance database. He casually, with a flick of his fingers, tossed the sheet across the table. The paper slid across the scratched surface, rustled, and stopped at the very edge, right in front of Elena's nose. "Live on, you say? Right. Take a look at your safety net. Your husband, Marcus Carter, economized on everything to pay for your endless wants. And the comprehensive coverage policy this year he bought from some guy in a parking lot. Fake. The form's real, with watermarks, but it's not in the registry. Saved 30 grand so you'd have enough for new boots." Brennan paused, savoring the effect. "You won't get a penny. The insurance company won't even let you through the door with this scrap paper." Brennan's words crashed down on Elena like a concrete slab, flattening her hopes. Her brain, professionally trained in financial schemes, instantly performed a deadly calculation that chilled her blood. The loan on the burned car, nearly $80,000. Current debts on 5 credit cards, $15,000. Interest on payday loans, another 6. And now there was no insurance that was supposed to close this black hole. The balance wasn't just zero, it was catastrophically negative. She was completely bankrupt. She stood in the middle of the filthy office in her hopelessly ruined trench coat, without a husband protector, without a car, and with debt she couldn't pay off in 10 years of employment. Her knees buckled, and she dropped heavily, like a sack, onto the chair. The very same one where half an hour ago she'd betrayed her husband for this non-existent money. Brennan watched her reaction attentively, rhythmically tapping the cheap pen on the desktop. Tap, tap, tap. "But that's not all," he continued, driving nails into the lid of her financial coffin. "Here's what bothered me all night. Why did the guy throw himself into the fire? Fine, the car, the metal, whatever. But he burned his hands to the bone, screaming like a stuck pig, smashing the window with his elbow, clawing at the glove box like a man possessed." I asked him while the paramedic was bandaging him up. Thought he was saving documents or a phone with compromising material. But he stayed quiet. Protecting you, fool that he is, didn't want to upset you. Brennan leaned forward, invading her personal space, and his voice became quiet, almost rustling, like dry leaves. But forensic experts, they're meticulous people. In that mess left from the glove box, they found some very interesting things. There, Mrs. Carter, was a lot of specific ash, dense stuff, and remains of bank vacuum packaging. A metal clip, the kind with a seal that doesn't melt in fire. Brennan made a theatrical pause, staring straight into her soul with his watery eyes. Your husband sold his share in the construction business yesterday, in secret from you, to make it a surprise. Cashed everything out completely. $50,000. Was bringing it home to close out your loans and mortgage once and for all. Planned to put the stacks on the table and say, Elena, we're free. Elena stopped breathing. The air in the room ran out. $50,000. That's nearly $50,000 in their savings. That's freedom. That's a new life without debt collector calls. That's what she'd staged this entire monstrous performance for. A whirlwind of memories tore through Elena's head, instantly reconstructing the picture of last night in the quarry. That suspicious call on the burner phone. Yeah, I've got it all. It wasn't about running away with a mistress. It was about cash. Marcus's nervous gesture protecting the glove box on the bump. He was guarding their future. The sweat on his face, from fear of losing the money. His desperate animal scream. Stop! You don't understand! When she pulled out the lighter. He wasn't afraid for the car. He was afraid she'd burn their salvation. And his leap into the fire, he was trying with his bare hands to pull those stacks of money from the flames. He was burning for her. And she dragged him away by the collar, thinking he'd gone mad with greed for the machine. Elena looked at her trembling hands lying on her knees, at the manicured fingers with expensive polish that yesterday had so confidently held the silver lighter. She remembered that light, casual, almost cinematic gesture with which she'd tossed the lighter into the cabin. That single toss had cost her $50,000. The car, a loving husband, and her own life. Every action she'd taken, dictated by paranoia, selfishness, and greed, hit the mark precisely, destroying everything she loved. She wasn't a victim of circumstances as she wanted to appear. She was the architect of her own catastrophe. She'd literally burned the money Marcus had obtained for her through blood and put Marcus in prison for trying to save it from the fire. Brennan stood with a grunt, making it clear the audience was over. He pulled her confiscated smartphone from the safe and carelessly handed it to her. Take your device. And go. You'll have to work a lot now, for a long time. 15 years, if you're lucky. He walked to the door and threw it wide open, releasing Elena into the corridor. Already at the threshold, he tossed one last phrase at her back, full of poisonous, annihilating sarcasm. By the way, how'd you pay for that gas at the station? Credit card? Well, at least you'll get cash back at the end of the month. $2. Every bit helps, right? This joke was the final control shot to the head of her self-esteem. Brennan hadn't just exposed her, he'd turned her grand tragedy into a cheap, vulgar farce. Elena found herself in the corridor. Brennan's office door closed with a dry, final click, cutting her off from the only person who understood the truth. Now she was absolutely alone. The corridor was empty. Even the escorts had left. Silence pressed on her ears, interrupted only by the insistent electrical buzzing of that same flickering lamp. Elena stood, clutching the cold smartphone in her hand like a useless brick. She felt like a hollow shell, a mannequin from which the air had been let out. Her façade had collapsed, exposing a gaping black void. No Instagram, no resources, no flow, no husband protector. There was only dirty floor, the smell of bleach, and the realization that she was the poorest person in the world because she was spiritually bankrupt. Suddenly, in the dead silence of the corridor, her phone came to life. Sharp, buzzing vibration made Elena flinch with her whole body, as if from an electric shock. The screen lit up, illuminating her haggard face, stained with soot and mascara, in deathly pale light. Not Marcus. Not a lawyer. An automatic push notification from the bank. Elena mechanically focused her gaze on the text. Alert! Late payment penalty on mortgage, $150. Your current balance, negative $145,000. Urgently pay off debt to avoid lawsuit and property seizure. The numbers danced before her eyes. A zero balance would be an unattainable dream for her. In her account, -1 life. Elena looked at the glowing screen, then shifted her empty gaze to the dirty wall with a children's drawing, then to her hands that smelled of smoke. A strange, gurgling sound escaped from her throat, either a sob or a cough. And then she began to laugh. It wasn't cheerful laughter. It was hysterical, barking laughter of a broken person, echoing off the institutional walls. She laughed at how cleverly she'd outsmarted everyone. Laughed at Brennan's cash back. Laughed that she'd burned $50,000 with a $40 lighter. Her laughter carried through the empty precinct corridor, frightening the duty officer at the entrance, and sounded like the epitaph of her successful life.